Thanks very much for joining us for this edition of the Intermodal Logistics Podcast. I'm Kevin Baxter, joined by my co-host for this edition, Intech Logistics CEO, Rick Legore. Hey, Rick.
Hey, great to be back.
And so today we are getting back to sort of the roots. So we're talking about trains and checking in on the industry overall. Hopefully we don't go off the rails. Had to use that one. All right.
Good dad joke.
Thank you. Yeah, it's only a few days after Father's Day, right? When we record this, so we still have that lingering. So we have brought in somebody who covers the industry every day, and that is Bill Stevens, correspondent and columnist for Trains Magazine. Bill, thanks very much for joining us.
Good morning. Thanks for having me. Looking forward to our chat.
So first of all, we always like to start with, especially a guest we haven't had on before, a little bit about yourself. So tell us about what got you into covering trains and sort of your background with the magazine.
Sure. At a young age, I was just fascinated with trains themselves, which eventually blossomed into an interest in railroads, where they go, what they carry, why, how they work. And I just found that fascinating. Also had a lifelong love of journalism. And, I had a paper route, which you don't hear about too much these days.
Yeah,
and
really lifelong.
Yeah, Railroad Street actually happened to be part of my route, which was convenient for me. But I thought that it would be a great idea to try to, marry these two really intense interests that I have, and started freelancing for trains back in the early 1990s, on and off. And then for the last almost 10 years now, it's been my full-time freelance gig.
Great. So getting into sort of the first piece that prompted this discussion, and it was something that you've sort of circled back on a couple of times over the years, I'm sure, was the T.D. Cowen analysis on railroads in terms of the need to gain volume to remain relevant. That's sort of the broad headline of the report, but tell us a little bit more about what the report said.
Well, it said that, it really outlined a big service gap between a stark service gap, even between truck and between rail, and said that the primary reason that railroads have been losing volume, setting aside coal, which we know railroads can't do anything about, is poor service or erratic service or service that doesn't meet the needs of the modern supply chain. And it said that 66% of the shippers that they surveyed received on-time performance of 80% or better from their trucking partners, compared to just 16% from railroads. And just 6% of rail shippers received service guarantees, compared to 37% from trucking carriers. And only 46% of rail customers receive a price quote within a week, compared to 94% of trucking customers. And so it's not good when you're measuring your response time with a calendar rather than a watch, especially today, right? When people go online and they expect an answer instantly, even more so now with AI. And if railroads can't grow, the T.D. Cowen analysts argued they're going to have to try to merge, which has been a steep climb. One of the things that struck me, there was a graph that showed a divergence between imports and intermodal loads starting around the time that the U.S. railroads started to implement precision scheduled railroading. And as part of that, as you well know, they dropped hundreds of interline lanes between origin and destination pairs that were low volume. And as Larry Gross, the intermodal analyst, would tell you, it's a very skeletal network, and they took off a couple of ribs. And so that was certainly a part of it. And part of that effort was to try to streamline the intermodal network and make it simpler, fewer work events. And the theory is that would make it more reliable, and therefore they would be able to get more volume. And in a way that worked at CSX. They were the most dramatic about it. CSX had a hub and spoke intermodal network, and they had a terminal in Northwest Ohio that didn't have a ramp. It was built without one. It was just a sorting center where trains would converge from all directions, and they'd lift boxes off one train, put them on another, or set them on the ground and then put them back up. And they touched about a third of CSX's overall intermodal volume. They're giving it basically an extra lift, or in some instances, a block swap. And when Hunter Harrison came in, he looked at that and said, "That makes no sense. It's low margin. You can't touch a box that many times." And so they got rid of 15% of their intermodal volume and went to a point-to-point intermodal network. And you look at the last few years, they've been having the top service marks in the Cowan survey and others. And they've also grown and replaced that lost volume. So that in and of itself is interesting. But the report also touched on the fact that the growth formula for railroads has been revenue growth, but that revenue growth has not been driven by volume growth. It's been driven by inflation rates, or rate increases faster than the rate of inflation, cost cutting, and share buybacks. And the underlying business has been treading water at best, and certainly hasn't been keeping up with industrial production, which is closely tied with the carload volumes. And intermodal hasn't been keeping pace with GDP or the growth in trucking tonnage. It's a little bit of an apples to oranges comparison when trucks are measured in tons and intermodal is measured in containers and trailers. But you add all that up together, and a lot of people say you can't continue to raise rates forever on a smaller base of business.
Well, you mentioned back in your LinkedIn post, sort of sharing this piece, you mentioned that you had similar discussions back about 8 years ago or so, where folks were not really that worried about that. They're happy to see the revenue continue to be in a good position, even though the volume at that point was already showing some not so great signs. So why now are they sort of coming around on the idea that this is something we need to address?
To your point, what I asked the analysts, I did an informal poll at the Rail Trends conference of about 8 analysts, and I said, "Are you investor clients concerned at all that railroads' earning growth has been, like I just said, propelled by rate increases, cost cutting, and share buybacks, and not by growth in the underlying business, which is moving freight?" And they said, "No, not at all." At the time, railroads, their stock prices were going up. They were outperforming the market, and the returns were great. And now that has changed, and there is this focus in the industry on shifting toward growth, because they know to a certain extent the cost-cutting story is over. They're just not going to get that much more juice out of reducing the OR by another point.
Right. The analysts went back at that time. They were really wound up about what they were seeing in the PSR. They love the stats as they're doing the comparison on balance sheet ratios and all that other all those financial stats. So yeah, I remember that time. They were like, "Yeah, this is great. This is awesome." But yeah, eventually you've got to get back to volume and growing the business.
Right. And a problem, PSR was implemented first on the Illinois Central Railroad in the 1990s, turned it into a just very, very profitable railroad. Then CN bought them. Hunter Harrison went on to CN, ultimately became COO and then CEO. And they just went on a growth tear after he was toward the end of his tenure. All sorts of traffic in Western Canada, and they went after international intermodal in a big way and made Canadian ports a gateway to the U.S. Midwest. And then when he went 2 years later, he retired in the end of 2009, 2010. 2 years later, goes to CP as part of a hedge fund proxy contest, and gets rid of some of their lower margin business, and really fixes that railroad, makes it operate better, a better competitor to CN. And when he hands the reins over to Keith Creel, his mission was revenue growth. And so you've seen them be very entrepreneurial for a class one, CP was, and they grew. So I think that prompted a feeling on Wall Street that, oh, do PSR and you'll grow. I don't believe that that's the case. I believe that's a uniquely Canadian phenomenon. And if you look at tonnage maps for the Canadian railroads and where they've grown, it's all been in Western Canada. In Eastern, those lines on the map, as you know, when you've got a tonnage density map, the thicker your line, the better. The line in Eastern Canada, Toronto, Montreal, and out to the Maritimes, has stayed the same thin line. So if PSR was responsible for growth, how come they didn't grow in the East? And so those same economic forces that are driving growth in Canada don't really exist in the U.S. And in fact, in the Eastern U.S., the carload stats have been, really dismal in this century. So getting that back is going to be a challenge. And I know you're more of an intermodal company, but carload is super important because it's 2/3 of the industry's revenue. And maintaining that physical plant, which is expensive, as you know, depends on that carload revenue, really.
So you mentioned like 2006 or so was around like that volume peak. So was PSR sort of potentially the reason why that started to shift downwards, or why 2006 would you say, and why are we still not coming back from that at all?
That's an interesting question, and it's a multifaceted answer. First, coal peaked in 2008 out of the Powder River Basin, thermal coal for electricity generation. So that was a huge driver of that. And in fact, between 2006 and 2008, the railroads couldn't haul enough coal out of the Powder River Basin. The regulators were angry at them. The utilities were angry at them, and they put in all this capacity and got it running right. But when the Great Recession hit, you look what happened to home building. We're only building half as many homes as we were prior to 2007, and that drives lumber business on the railroads and intermodal in terms of somebody furnishing a new house, and rock shipments, aggregates for new construction, all those things that go into housing. That's one. And continued offshoring of manufacturing helped. But at the same time, every time that there's been a big recession, railroad volume has ticked down and not recovered to the level that it was before the recession. And I think that shippers have found other ways of moving their freight, in addition to the economic forces that are at work here. And also around 2004, the railroads gained pricing power, and it wasn't just a commodity anymore, and they could, earn a decent return on the business. And I think as those rates went up, some shippers, you reached their pain threshold and they shifted more business over to the highway.
So getting back to the report, obviously it painted the picture, but what are the recommendations there that railroads do to try and get things back on the right track?
Yeah, they made a few
off the rails, on the right track. Sorry.
Yes, exactly.
That one was unintentional.
Yep. They said that they need to improve freight visibility. It's kind of an old school AEI reader system right now, where you've got these readers every 20 miles or so, and you don't necessarily know where your car is in real time. You don't know if it's in a yard, if it's on the customer's spur. And so there's been an effort through RailPulse and other ventures to put telematics on cars so that it gives real-time visibility. And as you know, truckers have had this for a long time. And uh, one person argued that, well, it's actually less important in trucking because it's more reliable. And it's more important in rail because you want to know, are my empties coming in, or is that load that I really need coming in, and where is it, and when's it going to get here? Um, so that was one of the recommendations. Um, Railroads need to make it easier for customers to interact with the railroad. Um, and the railroads will tell you that they're doing that. Union Pacific is big on APIs to do data exchange, and all their customer web portals are improving. But shippers would tell you they're not there yet. Um, Need to become more operationally flexible. I mean, that's one of the structural disadvantages of a railroad. I mean, steel wheel on steel rail is the most efficient way to move freight on land, but you're also stuck on those rails. If there's a flood, a fire, a landslide, a derailment in front of you, you really are limited in your detour routes. So that causes delays. If you're a truck, you get off the interstate, go on the back roads for a while, and you're good to go. Um, and so, they're kind of starting from behind. But boosting operational flexibility, I think, also would mean keeping a sufficient buffer of crews on hand. Traditionally, what's happened to the railroads is there's a freight downturn. Oh, we're going to lay off our train and engine crews, and then too many of them don't come back, or not as many, or in certain key places on the railroad. And all of a sudden you've got a crew shortage, and you can't just go grab somebody off the street and sit them in the cab of a locomotive. It takes 6 months to at least to train them. And the railroads say they're committed now to maintaining that buffer. We'll see, if hopefully volume inflects, but
It's a test
there are
period
good.
right now, I guess. Huh?
Yeah,
Well, let's hope we don't hit
there,
that recession, because we do. You've just said every time we hit a recession, we go back down further. So
yeah,
that would
exactly.
definitely challenge that.
Yeah, and then the fourth, of course, is to improve and maintain their service levels. And they said, we view the levers of growth as largely within control of the railroads.
So, say they do all these things. Is there a concern about telling the story to get shippers who maybe went away from railroad because they had some issue with one of those aspects of it, or more than one of those aspects? Is there a concern about telling the story to get them back into the fold?
I don't think so. I think that what railroads have shown is that there's an untapped demand for rail traffic, and one of the things that this report mentioned was that since they've been doing their survey for about a decade now, consistently shippers have said, we want to move more volume to rail, but we can't because it's not reliable enough. So that seems to be the problem point is how do you get past that? You talk to shortline railroads, on the carload side, and they're able to outgrow the class ones, by a percent or point or two on volume every year. So the railroads are working more closely with their shortline partners now. And you look at the intermodal service, I think the JB Hunts and Schneiders of the world would tell you that it is better than it has been in a while. Now that we're past the crew shortages that came after the pandemic and all the disruption in the labor markets and freight markets too. Then.
And the railroads have been doing some pretty heavy investing, at least BNSF, UP, in terms of improving their ramp structure, adding lift to their ramps, which should absolutely help in terms of service levels.
And what have you seen in terms of service levels for your customers?
For us, we've seen the customers, we've really seen service really, really, really improve. Of course, there were some challenges during the pandemic, but since then, granted, volumes are down and you really don't get tested on service. When volumes are down, it's really in the heat of the battle as to whether or not you're going to survive on the service side of intermodal. But we've seen the investments come through, and they've been consistently reliable, whereas prior they were inconsistently consistent, which makes for a challenge. So since it's been consistently reliable for an extended period of time, what we've seen is we have the ability to recover on the dray side if there's any shortcomings and cover up any problems that may land in there. So we feel pretty good about where the direction of the intermodal side goes. In terms of the question that you had, Kevin, in terms of message, I think we're missing the message a little bit on the intermodal piece. I think the electric truck has taken the oxygen out of the room for intermodal, and intermodals and the electrification of the trucking market is going to take a lot of time and has some shortcomings, particularly long haul. And intermodal is kind of non-existent, kind of like the you made comment on an article out of Wall Street Journal about crossing the Mexican border with I don't remember exactly, but electric, let's call them shuttles that are going back and forth, because it's going to address the issue of trucking getting locked up at the border, at the southern border of Mexico. And where's the conversation about railroads? Railroads already exist. They're steel wheel. They cross. Nothing in that article talks about there's already a solution for that. And why would we have to go and put something else in place? That didn't make any sense. So anyway, I just think I'm rambling, because I just think the message is we're missing some of the message right now. And even on the sustainability side, people can turn over to intermodal tomorrow versus the electrification of truck is going to be a while, at least on the long haul side.
What do you think, though? Isn't there an opportunity with electrification for drayage? Because, what the big limitation, right, is range.
Yeah.
That is absolutely the case. And we've looked at that and thought absolutely that is a great place to go ahead and put it. It still has some challenges in terms of weight. So that is an issue. But overall, in terms of electrification of where can you go ahead and put that in terms of intermodal, yeah, dray seems to make the most sense. But by the way, we're supposed to ask the questions of you, and you're asking questions of us.
It's interesting. I've learned a lot already. Thank you.
But keep them coming. Keep them coming. I like the interchange.
Yeah. So getting back to the other piece, and you teased this a little bit at the beginning, and it's mentioned in the article, the original article that we're talking about as well, is the whole idea of the merger, helping some of these potential service issues, because then you're just using one rail, potentially transcontinental, which we don't have right now. And there has been talk from even leadership of some of these companies that maybe this is a way we might go. So where does that stand? How big are the hurdles to doing something like that at this point?
Well, there's a real big reason why we haven't seen a merger of big Class 1 systems, and that is the 2001 merger rules that the Surface Transportation Board imposed. And to put context around that, we had mega mergers in the 1990s. Union Pacific, Southern Pacific ended in a meltdown that started in Texas and brought gridlock to them. And then the Conrail split between CSX and Norfolk Southern got off on the wrong foot for NS for technical reasons. And then eventually both railroads kind of fell down, and it took a while for them to recover service. Along comes BNSF and CN saying, hey, here's our merger application. We want to merge. And I don't think at that time Conrail was even quite, or CSX and Norfolk Southern and their respective portions of Conrail were quite running up to speed yet. And so the board put a moratorium on mergers, and then a year later came out with really rules that are a much higher hurdle. There's a public interest test that wasn't there before. And then they also said it had to enhance competition. Previously, the bar was not harm competition. So that's a big difference. And those old rules really were designed to encourage railroads to combine, because for a long time there were too many railroads, too much track chasing too little traffic. And that was the story of railroading, especially in the Northeast and Midwest in the 70s prior to the Staggers Act. So anyway, we haven't seen any of the big railroads show up and say, hey, let's merge, because they don't think that they can get past this hurdle. And, I think that was driven home a bit with the battle for Kansas City Southern. Now, Kansas City Southern was so small that it had an exemption from those new rules. And depending on the merger partner, it could be judged under the old rules. When CN appeared to have won the battle for KCS, it applied to put KCS into an independent voting trust, which is the common thing that they do. Merger is under review. The KCS shareholders will be able to get their money right away. And the Surface Transportation Board turned down that request and said they didn't show it was in the public interest. And they raised an interesting point about, it could destabilize the industry by making things unbalanced, and CP would then have to find a different merger partner. But anyway, fast forward to today, and I think it is the lack of growth and the lackluster stock performance of the railroads that is driving this conversation about potential mergers. The companies always look at who their best merger partner is, so that's not different. But to have some of the boards at the railroads discussing it and taking a fresh look at it is different. It's interesting to see the responses from the railroads. UP CEO Jim Vena, to his credit, answered my question, explained why he thought mergers were a good idea, but also did raise the point that, hey, this is a big hurdle to hit from the regulatory side. And the other CEOs kind of said the same thing, although not as enthusiastic as Jim, perhaps, about the benefits of a merger. And, we've seen that from the CPKC merger, where single line service on their cross-border intermodal has really prompted a lot of growth. I mean, Schneider, the main customer on that train, has been doing business in Mexico for 30 years. And as you know, before CPKC, there was no single line service. Well, now they've got single line service, and that train, was up 40% year over year. So I think that to a certain extent shows the power of single line service. And the thinking would be that if you do that on a nationwide scale, you're going to get growth because you eliminate the handoffs and delays and complexity and cost of interchanging cars in Chicago or St. Louis or New Orleans. And then there's the issue of the whole midsection of the country, the watershed issue, where if you've got an origin, let's say it's 200 miles west of the Mississippi and a destination that's 200 miles on the east side of the Mississippi, 800-mile haul for one railroad isn't bad, but for two, they're really not going to be interested. And so I think rail share in the Mississippi Valley area is below where it reasonably you could expect that it should be. And so with one railroad, you could tap that market. And just single line service just seems to be such a huge advantage. The way I like to think about it, to explain to people who aren't familiar with the industry, is imagine there were, two airlines in the east, two airlines in the west, and you couldn't fly New York to LA without stopping in Chicago at Midway, by the way, and then taking an Uber to O'Hare, going through security again, getting on your, bringing your luggage with you, and then flying out to LA and having to book two tickets. It's absurd, right? When you think about it that way. And obviously there's a lot of intermodal service that's step on, step off in Chicago, where they just change crews and they go and it is smooth. But if you want to talk about growing industry, you're going to need to go to those smaller volume lanes, and mostly that's rubber tire interchange, not steel wheel. And then we're back to our Midway O'Hare analogy.
Yeah, that where you're talking about slightly west of Mississippi, slightly east of the Mississippi, that has absolutely been a challenge. And not only as a cost situation, that transition, that interline adds a couple, 3 days on something that should be, it becomes transit challenged when it's competing against truck. And it's a lane that not many people are going to go take unless there's some specific needs associated with capacity that would drive them to go that direction.
Right. And, you can't blame railroads for playing to their strength, which is large volumes, long distances. That's what they do. But I would like to think that they can also do other things. Come up with a better way to handle short haul intermodal. The double stack car is not really friendly for starting up a low volume lane because you need to have 6 loads right off the bat. Profitability becomes a challenge, as pick your number, 750, 500, wherever it goes. And that's where most freight moves is railroads are going longer and longer haul, higher volumes, and the freight market is going more dispersed, smaller shipments. So if they want to go where the freight is, they're going to have to figure out a way to do shorter haul and do it economically, which kind of brings us back to Wall Street, because Wall Street wants them to keep their OR, around 60 plus or minus 2 points. The CEOs have learned if you step outside of that OR box, you're going to have an activist investor banging on your door. And that's happened multiple times, over the past 10 years or so. So it's difficult, I think, for railroads to develop a service that doesn't have that's not going to erode their operating ratio.
Here in Indianapolis, we saw some creativity between the CN and the Indiana Railroad, where it went ahead and created a stop-off point to go ahead and interchange between CN and Indiana Railroad, and Indiana Railroad ended up putting together an intermodal ramp right here, and has worked out really well for people shipping from west to east, particularly coming off of international service up in Canada. It actually saved time and saved some money going that direction.
Yeah, and I think there are probably opportunities around the industry for additional service like that. Right now, Genesee and Wyoming is looking at that with autonomous rail cars from parallel systems, testing it. They say, there's 10,000 trucks a day that come out of the port of Savannah, and we can handle them inland. Right now, we can't. They used to run an intermodal service there to an inland terminal, but that they just proved that they couldn't be competitive. So maybe with autonomous, they can be. But there's talk about regulatory hurdles.
So where do you think this all goes with the merger talk? I mean, obviously there are ways to do partnerships short of an actual merger that could potentially smooth these processes a bit, but where do you think it all ends up kind of landing in the next few years?
I still have a hard time seeing how it gets past go at the Surface Transportation Board. You can make an argument that those 2001 rules are a product of their times, right? They reflected the problem then, which was a lot of consolidation brought problems. Let's stop it. And for years after that, railroads were growing and gaining market share. Now you flip it around. They're not growing. They're not gaining market share. And interline service is a barrier to growth at some level on certain moves. Partnerships are good. I mean, CN and UP and Ferromex have shown that with their Falcon Premium service, linking Canada, the US, and Mexico. But one of the things in the STB decision about the CN Kansas City Southern attempt to merge, there was a paragraph in there that said that the board, let me back up. If an Eastern Railroad and a Western Railroad walk up to the STB and say, hey, here's our merger application, that's immediately going to prompt a merger application from the remaining 2 railroads.
Yeah.
And what the STB noted was that if we do get a Class 1 merger application, we're not even going to be finished reviewing the first one yet when we've got a second one. Mm-hmm. And the board said that was something that really couldn't happen. And I've run this through in my mind. I talked to people who've been involved in mergers in the past on the legal and regulatory side. And is there a brokered solution? Does the STB call everybody in and say, all right, these 2 are going to merge. how do we handle this? Because that's another aspect of the new merger rules is railroads have to consider their downstream effects. In other words, if BNSF and NS were to merge, what is that going to prompt from the other railroads? Limited number of partners, it's really easy to figure out. But from a regulatory standpoint, that's a heavy lift. And I asked Marty Oberman, the retired chairman of the STB, I said, should these rules, the 2001 rules, be modified in some way? And he said, oh my God, no. It would take 10 years at least. And then there'd be lawsuits and, so that was interesting. But I just don't see, I think mergers would be very good for the industry. And as Jim Vena says, good for the country, because if we get more freight off the road and onto the rail, it's better for everyone. But I don't know how you get past the regulatory challenge. And, the other aspect of this is I think people were thinking with the Republican administration in Washington that it would be look more favorably on a transcon merger. Don't know, yet to be seen.
A lot of other fires going on right now.
Yes. Unfortunately.
Yes, lots of other things going on. So for things to get better with the railroad, clearly at this point, it wouldn't be on the merger side. So there's other things that we need to be focusing on in terms of service, price, consistency. You do a lot of reporting, both from our shipper's perspective and the railroad perspective. So perception is reality. So if you're taking a look at both of those, both of them have different perceptions. Where's the biggest disconnect between what the railroads think is going on versus what the shippers think is going on in from what you've been able to attain?
I think it's that service gap. Railroads say, hey, we're providing better service than we ever have. And that may be true, but you have to back up a decision point to the shipper that says, am I going to send this load via the rail or am I going to send this via the highway? And when you compare those two, as this survey, this TD Cowen report showed, there's just such a huge service gap there. CSX CEO Joe Hendricks came to the railroad industry, a longtime auto executive, so he was a customer of the railroads. He said, we did business with the railroads because we have to, not because we wanted to. And so he's trying to change the culture of CSX to make it so that so the customers want to do business with the railroads. And what I thought was really interesting is, starting in February, they started to have some real congestion and service problems. They've got a couple lines out, one due to hurricane damage and one due to the Howard Street Tunnel project in Baltimore, which will enable them to run double stack in the I-95 corridor, as well as the Baltimore to Midwest corridor. Whenever you hear service problems like what CSX was having, they're also accompanied by shipper complaints. There were none, not none, but I didn't hear them. There was nothing loud. STB didn't get complaints. And they really chalked that up to the fact that CSX was communicating and was proactive with the customers and said, oh, hey, we know this is late, but here's when we think we can get it there. And he also said, we looked at, we talked with customers, what loads do you really need today? We'll make every effort to get those there. So that's different. And that's really encouraging to me. Even more encouraging is that they got their network back up to speed and cleared all that congestion months sooner than anyone was expecting.
So the Mexico piece, you mentioned, obviously CPKC has the single line solution, and you mentioned some of the other services that are out there. And it seems like every couple of months we've been seeing some other sort of initiative there with intermodal. So where is that going in terms of the market share that they're actually able to get? And I know we've had folks on from who are familiar with the balance in Mexico, where truck is very heavily tilted and the opportunity level should be there, but it hasn't moved as much as maybe people thought. So where is it right now?
That's interesting. That is really, as you mentioned, a huge untapped market. It's not untapped, but they're really underpenetrated. Um, and if you look at, JB Hunt and BNSF just announced that they were going to expand their quantum service, which is a 95% guaranteed on-time performance. And they monitor the loads and will take them off a train if it's running late and truck it the rest of the way. But so that's really encouraging. And they saw, the addressable market there, I want to say was 4 million to 7 million trucks that could be converted to intermodal. And that's huge when BNSF itself held 5 million loads last year. So those are big numbers. And the CPKCS merger, as we discussed, prompted that competitive response from BNSF, as well as the interline service from with UPC and Ferromex. But the other new thing that it was related to the CPKC merger, but not really, was the new intermodal lane for CSX and CPKC through Meridian, Mississippi. Their networks really don't connect very well. So they filled a 70 odd mile gap between CSX at Montgomery and CPKC at Meridian, Mississippi by buying a G&W short line. And so that's a heavy auto parts lane. And Schneider really expects to be able to tap that Southeast Texas, Mexico opportunity. It's really just getting going now, so it's really too early to say how it's going. But Schneider thinks that's twice the opportunity of their Mexico to Chicago business. So that is certainly encouraging as well. And there's obviously, as that service grows, there's opportunity for other intermodal customers to jump on that as well. And it provides competition with Norfolk Southern.
One of the challenges we've seen going south into Mexico is the Mexican customs brokerage groups that you have to work with to go into Mexico. They discourage shippers to go ahead and flip from truck to intermodal. They're not super familiar with the intermodal process, so they say it can't be done. There's just a lot of really small customs brokers in the Mexican market, and they just are adverse to change. And they can flip a customer that you have, or a potential customer that you have, that says, "Hey, this is going to be happening." They flip it around right away and say, the shipper will come back and say, "My customs broker is saying, no, that won't happen, can't happen, won't do it." And we have found that to happen more times than not. So the stuff that's been moving consistently, like the auto stuff that you just spoke about, that's going to continue moving. But additional commodities in other markets, it's just a slow process in terms of getting those to flip, not because of the shipper side, but because of those custom brokers that sit on the Mexican border.
Certainly a wrinkle we don't see at the northern border.
No, it's a challenge. And as we really started to go after the Mexican business, it was something that we did not anticipate. And as we talked with others in the market and actually down in Mexico that they're trying to push, as a matter of fact, we've had them on a couple people from down in the Mexican market, and they say, yes, it's a hurdle. We don't understand it. We've tried to get through it, and we'll do everything we can on our side to try to help you on and they have, in terms of situations that pop up like that.
That's interesting. And especially when you see the customs process and the wait times at Laredo, and the trains just, it's a crew change, and everything, literally everything gets x-rayed, or whatever the tech is that they're using to, see what's in those cars. It's better security. And way more fluid, and especially now at Laredo, since CPKC has added the second bridge, which really doubles their capacity. And there's a proposal as well to add a new short line railroad, basically at Eagle Pass, which is the number 2 rail gateway to Mexico, and that would be a secure corridor, and obviously a lot more capacity than what's there now, and the bridge is the bottleneck there.
Well, Bill, I think we could go on a lot of different directions beyond here, but we get plenty of articles from you and on LinkedIn. Tell people how they can find you.
Well, I'm on LinkedIn. Bill Stevens is the name. You can look me up on trains.com at the trains portion of the website. There's newswire content there. You can find me in print. Yes, print magazines are still a thing, and please subscribe. And also some of my work also appears on Freight Waves because we are under common ownership with Firecrown now, and we're coming up on a year with that.
Great, Bill. Thank you very much for taking the time.
Yeah,
thank you. Thanks. Nice chatting with you both.
So yeah, I think we touched the tip of the iceberg there, but the volume conversation, obviously it's sort of multi-pronged. We're talking about rail cars themselves and also intermodal to maybe a little lesser extent in this particular discussion, but very interesting to hear Bill's perspective on sort of how we got to where we are and where the attitudes are now.
Absolutely. And then a lot of it is perception is reality. So we have a lot of different looks at, what service is. One of the ones that's going on right now. So all those shippers and IMCs out there that use the railroads or an IMC for your intermodal freight, connect in with the Journal of Commerce because they're doing a survey right now. They do a quarterly service in terms of validating what other people are saying in terms of how's your service, how's your customer service, how's the technology. I think it ends here at the end of June. But any case, reality is, or perception is reality. And what has consistently come out of the Journal of Commerce anyway on the service side is that the service is actually pretty good. And what we like to tout is non-asset IMCs are typically rated the highest in terms of service levels. And because of some of the flexibility that we have and some of the other things that we have in terms of being able we're not locked in on different railroads and we're not locked in on particular drayage carriers. So I've kind of gone off the rails, as you said earlier in our conversation at the very beginning, but there's a lot to be said in terms of trying to try to find other ways to find volume and increase the share that intermodal has, and it has dropped off. And there's just so many positives out there. I think stuff like that, we're having conversations with Bill and others in the industry to help get the news out there that there's more to be had than the perception that's at the water cooler or back in the olden days, the copiers, that would go around that, well, I experienced this 10 years ago, and so that's the way it's always going to be. I mean, that's not where we are today. Well,
yeah, I thought it was interesting that the analysis was basically saying, like, on the rail car side more, that if the service is perceived to be there, then people will just come back. So that's interesting to see. It's not necessarily dragging somebody back. If they hear good things, then all of a sudden there they are. So,
right.
But as Bill said, lots of places to find him. We appreciate having him on, and we appreciate you watching and listening to the podcast. As always, feel free to drop us a comment. Please do rate and review us wherever you get your podcasts. Follow us, subscribe. Again, however you do it, we appreciate it. Feel free to email us as well if you have a longer comment that you'd like to drop in. Podcast at intechlogistics.com. Our website is www.intechlogistics.com for more about the company as well. Rick, thanks very much.
All right. Thank you again, Kevin.
We'll talk to you next time.